Thank you very much, Evelyn. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Thank you also for organizing this wonderful conference, and thanks to the rector and the administration of UNIRIO, to your graduate students who I know are invaluable in organizing an event of this kind. On a personal note, it is a great pleasure for me to come back to UNIRIO. Not my first time, but it's one of my favorite places. I'm just delighted to have the opportunity to meet old friends and find new ones and participate in a conference of this importance and this centrality in modern theater studies. I'm going to speak today on a topic that connects in a number of interesting ways with that wonderful video presentation that Evelyn presented. It will carry on from some of the subjects in that and enrich those, I think, and bring new perspectives to them as well. The subject of my talk is theatrical space in the post-dramatic era. Let's see if I get this. There we are. For most of the history of theatrical production, both in the East and the West, this art has been created and received in a very similar basic theatrical structure. Whether we are talking about the classical Sanskrit theater in India, the first No theaters in Japan, or the Greek theaters of the classic period, we find the same basic spatial arrangement. An area with a raised platform for the performers, and facing it, a space for spectators to stand or sit passively and observe the story the actors are presenting. During the following centuries, many details of this arrangement changed, but many theaters around the world continue to follow this basic spatial arrangement. During the 20th century, however, a variety of challenges to this long, stable arrangement appeared. The first, and one of the most important of these, was what later came to be called site-specific theater. Although that term did not come into general usage until the 1970s, when a number of experimental figures in the art world began to produce outdoor art utilizing materials of the natural world. Although the term site-specific implies the creation of a work of art in a particular location to which it is intimately united, when the term came to be widely used in the theater, it took on a more general application and came to refer to almost any production not created inside a conventional theater space. Thus, it essentially challenged the basic architectural assumption followed for centuries in both the East and the West, which associated the art of theater with a particular building, normally expressively created for the presentation of that art. The first significant theater directors to challenge this centuries-long tradition were among the leading theater makers of the early 20th century, the German Max Reinhardt and the Russian Nikolai Evelyn. Reinhardt's first major experiment of this sort was staging the medieval story of Every Man on the steps of the cathedral in Salzburg, Austria, for the first Salzburg Festival in 1920. Later, in 1934, Reinhardt and Evrainov each staged major outdoor spectacles. Reinhardt's Merchant of Venice, mentioned this morning, or this afternoon, in an actual canal-side square in that city, and Evrainov's The Storming of the Winter Palace, based on an actual event of the Russian Revolution, staged in the very location of that event. No general term for such productions was yet in use. Evrainov's work was often called a mass action, and Reinhardt's was called a localization, terms we don't use anymore. Both, though, were central examples of what later would be called site-specific, since they were staged in the actual locations where their recreations actually or imaginatively took place. One may see such work as a kind of culmination of realism in the theater, which during the previous century had more and more sought to create exact representations of reality. It is also worth noting that these major early examples of site-specific theater, in sharp contrast to the site-specific art later in the century, did not utilize nature, but sought urban architectural environments, much more in keeping with the traditional urban representations of theater itself. During the mid-20th century, the traditional proscenium stage was more significantly challenged by a variety of alternative stage-audience relationships, which we saw several times in the video today. Arena theater, theater in the round, traverse or corridor theater, and the thrust stage or the Shakespearean stage were mostly inspired by non-proscenium theaters of the past. The first to appear was the arena, or theater in the round, headed by the Glenn Hughes Theater at the University of Washington in 1940. The arena stage in Washington, D.C., now renamed for its longtime director, Zelda Fischhandler, opened in 1950, and it remains the best-known arena theater in the United States. The first thrust stage in modern times was created in 1953 for the Stratford Festival in Canada, whose director, Tyrone Guthrie, sought to create an audience relationship close to that of Shakespeare's Elizabethan theater. This stage and a parallel venture in Minneapolis brought the thrust stage to prominence in the United States during the 1960s and 1970s, and many major new theaters were built in the thrust form, most notably the Vivian Beaumont at Lincoln Center in New York, which opened in 1965. The first major traverse theater in the West appeared in a theater of that name, which opened in Edinburgh in 1963 and is still operating. The traverse stage has been less popular than other non-proscenium arrangements, but it continues to be employed as an interesting alternative. The current production in New York of Stephen Sondheim's musical Pacific Overtures uses a traverse stage, probably an imitation of the classic Kabuki Hanamichi, since the play is set in classic Japan. The 1960s also saw the development of an even more extreme form of audience-performance relationship, in a form which Richard Schechner called in 1968 the environmental theater. The major director to whom Schechner looked as the creator of this approach was the Polish innovative artist Jerzy Grotowski. In his small laboratory theater, Grotowski began in 1959 to create intimate productions in which the spaces of the actors and those of the spectators were mixed. The black figures you see are actors, the white ones are spectators in this production. Schechner and his designer, Jerry Rojo, brought this approach to the New York theater with the production of Schechner's Performance Group, which was founded in 1967. During the final 20 years of the century, the dominant experimental form which challenged traditional architectural arrangements, both internally and externally, was, as I have said, the so-called site-specific theater, similar to the earlier experiments of people like F. Reinhold and Reinhardt, although the term was first used in the early 1950s. Such works early in the century were fairly isolated, but toward the end of the century, site-specific theater became an international phenomenon and a major challenge to traditional concepts of both theater space and theater architecture. Theater now took place in almost every conceivable type of space, both natural and man-made. The term post-dramatic entered the modern critical discourse with the appearance in 1999 of Hans Thies Lehmann's book, Postdramatische Theater, translated into English in 2006 and into Portuguese in 2013. Lehmann situates the rise of the post-dramatic in a variety of practices that entered the Western theater in the late 1960s. Among the artists and groups Lehmann cites as developing the post-dramatic are Robert Wilson, Jan Fabre, the Wooster Group, Heiner Müller, and the British company Forced Entertainment. The fact that the rise of the modern site-specific theater movement took place at the same time as Lehmann's post-dramatic theater might suggest a connection between these two, both challenges to traditional theater. But the site-specific challenge to traditional theater architecture has been far less radical than the post-dramatic challenge to traditional theater narrating and dramatic structure. Despite moving outside traditional theater structures, site-specific performances almost invariably have reproduced the traditional performance-audience relationships, although these relationships are challenged by Lehmann's post-dramatic theater. One of the most famous site-specific performances of the late 20th century, for example, was Peter Brook's premiere of the Mahabharata in an abandoned stone quarry in 1985. Since that time, that quarry has been used for other performances almost every year. Brook's major change to the quarry, however, was to install seating distinctly reminiscent of the classic Greek theater. And so little was the actual performance affected by these surroundings that it successfully toured to quite traditional theaters around the world. The point I want to make here is that the physical surroundings of the audience and stage were radically changed architecturally, but the relationship between the audience and stage spatially remains quite traditional. The changes in space had little, if any, relationship to the elements Lehmann associates with the post-dramatic, that is, attack on traditional ideas of narrativity, sequence, coherence, cause and effect, and even mimesis. Generally speaking, the actor-audience relationship remained unchanged, even when the audience was split by the traverse stage or more radically separated, as in the environmental performances by Grotowski. A variation of site-specific theater, the promenade theater, developed toward the end of the century. This suggested an approach somewhat closer to the post-dramatic, since it freed the audience from the passive role and demanded that the audience, like the actors, could move about in the location. In fact, however, this new approach did not really destabilize traditional actor-audience relationships, since audience members were still strictly controlled and could simply move from one location to another, and in each location placed in a traditional passive group to watch the performance. It was not until the new century that a really new physical approach to theatrical space offered a dynamic which opened the audience experience to something more closely reflecting the changes the post-dramatic had brought to the traditional dramatic text. This was the so-called immersive theater, a term invented by the British company Punch Drunk, formed in the year 2000. Within the next decade, immersive theater became the most popular new experimental theatrical form in the United States and Great Britain, and then in more expanded form in a flood of reports and essays about this new approach. Immersive theater was characterized as a form specifically opposed to traditional theater. And it is not entirely surprising that the first book about this new form by Josephine Macon in 2013 characterized it as breaking with traditional rules and conventions, very much in the same way that Lima saw the post-dramatic breaking with dramatic form. This is not to suggest that the immersive and the post-dramatic seriously overlap as concepts, although they both occupy a similar cultural position in that they challenge traditional practice. Despite some important affinities, one is based on challenges to traditional dramatic structure and narration, and the other to traditional configurations of theatrical space and reception. It would be well, before going further then, to discuss more specifically what precisely is involved in speaking of immersive theater. Since the modern use of this word as a theater term began with Punch Drunk, it is best to begin with how Punch Drunk conceived this term. Their website describes their approach in simple terms. Basically, spatial and experimental. I quote, "A team of designers takes over deserted spaces and applies a cinematic level of detail to immerse the audience in the new world of this play," unquote. It should be noted that the emphasis is upon the creation of a complex physical space, not a dramatic structure. When the first immersive performances were presented, critics, still lacking that new term, often referred to them as site-specific theater. Punch Drunk's work, however, was as different from site-specific as it was from traditional theater. And the focus on these differences can indicate the extent of the innovation of immersive. Promenade theater allowed the traditionally fixed audience mobility, challenged traditionally fixed audiences with mobility, but the audience remained passive, simply guided from one location to another. Immersive spectators, in contrast, can decide individually wherever they want to go within the production, how long they will remain where they go, and to what extent they will physically interact with any elements in that space. Although in general site-specific productions expected passive audiences, their use of specially selected and unconventional locations have caused many critics to consider immersive theater simply a variation of site-specific. In fact, in one critical aspect, they're totally opposed. Site-specific locations are selected by their users, while immersive locations are created. Site-specific theater, as its name implies, seeks a particular site with already existing cultural, social, or physical characteristics, which are central to the concept of the production. Immersive theater, to recall their own description, seeks deserted spaces, spaces which have as little specific cultural detail as possible, precisely the opposite of site-specific spaces. The major artistic work of a company like Punch Drunk is then to fill up these neutral spaces with a vast amount of physical detail, some abstract, but most realistic and detailed, so as to create a completely new environment which never existed before and which the audience can then be immersed. Most of the major Punch Drunk productions have used abandoned warehouses, which have offered them several floors of essentially open space, which they can then subdivide into units of varying sizes and shapes, and create within these environments, by the use of lighting and elaborate furnishings, different little theaters. Here is one of the warehouses they've used. Their 2006 production of Faust, which they co-produced with the National Theatre of Great Britain, used all 5 stories of this empty warehouse in Wapping, an old industrial section of London. This building provided them with 14,000 square meters of space, the equivalent of more than 100 average British homes. This huge project won several major awards and brought immersive theater for the first time to the attention of the general theater-going public of Great Britain. Punch Drunk also introduced this new form to the United States with its enormously popular and successful production Sleep No More, which opened in New York in 2011 and is still running 6 years later, making it by far the most successful of the Punch Drunk productions and of their dozens of imitators, first in New York and London, and now all around the globe. Since this production has become the most familiar representative of this new form, I want to consider it more closely to point out how fundamentally immersive theater challenges and subverts assumptions about the traditional theater and traditional theater space that go all the way back to classic times. These challenges arise actually in different areas. 3 of the most fundamental features of theater: the text, the audience, and the imaginary world of the actors, which takes us into the space. Let us begin with the text, the traditional foundation of theatrical performance. The text for Sleep No More, like that of most Punch Drunk productions, is actually a blending of a wide variety of textual material, both from classic and popular sources. As the title suggests, the basic text of the production is Shakespeare's play Macbeth. But that source contributes only characters, images, and scattered lines. Equally important are noir films, especially Alfred Hitchcock's film Rebecca and Vertigo, from which also come lines, characters, and images. Another important source was the story of a series of witchcraft trials, actually held in Scotland in 1697. The mixing together of such narrative material, some from history, some from high culture, some from popular culture, was then woven into a multi-voiced, multi-directional text that laymen would unquestionably characterize as post-dramatic. The actual performance conditions of Sleep No More, however, removed this text even further from the possible interpretive strategies of traditional theater. Even if audience members wished to follow this text, it would be impossible to do so, since it is being delivered by multiple characters scattered through the nearly 100 rooms of the space. And although audience members may move freely or follow a particular actor, neither will guarantee any coherence to what they experience. The textual side of the performance is further complicated by the existence of a variety of other texts. There are notes left in typewriters, notices posted on bulletin boards, private letters between the characters in sealed envelopes, which audience members may or may not find and open. Even recorded messages, which are tripped off when a spectator moves into a particular space. All of these add to the aleatory quality of the text as a whole. Perhaps no one will open on a particular night that letter from Lady Macbeth to her husband, or read the note in the typewriter, or perhaps only one spectator will. Chance combinations replace traditional narrative cause and effect. That's the text. Now the audience. The role of the audience is unquestionably the best-known feature of immersive theater. And although the concept of a moving rather than a passive audience, a passive seated audience, was well established in late 20th century theater, those moving audiences were as a rule highly controlled. The immersive theater radically changed this by allowing the audience to move freely about among the multiple locations wherever they wanted and remaining in any location as long as they wished. Coincidentally, in 2011, the same year that Sleep No More opened in New York, a major new theoretical work appeared in which to many people seemed to provide an ideal critical approach for understanding the new immersive theater audience. This was Jacques Rancière's The Emancipated Spectator. Rancière's Emancipated Spectator, serving as a co-creator of the theatrical performance, was closely in line with the concept of the post-dramatic, but seemed even more closely descriptive of the type of audience ensured by a production like Sleep No More. Here the audience, given freedom to assemble their individual performance experience, encouraged many critics to call productions like Sleep No More fulfillments of Rancière's idea of the emancipated spectator. In fact, there were distinct and important limits to this emancipation. The audience members were instructed when they arrived that they were not to speak to anyone, either actors or other spectators, which is hardly an encouragement for intervention in the performance. The other major restriction imposed on the spectators was that they must at all times wear neutral white masks, which were provided by the company. The stated justification for both of these rules, no speaking and wearing a mask, was that the illusion of the play would be compromised by the sight or sound of a companion or even another specific spectator. The silent masked figures were to be regarded as, in a sense, invisible to the other audience members, unlike the performers. The masks used in many punch-drunk productions also served an additional and related purpose, underlining the radical departure of these performances from traditional theater.